going on, kids? So today we're going to take a look at a couple of different ignition system styles. So we all know that cars need something to make that spark just before top dead center of their compression stroke, but different vehicles are going to do that in different ways. And it's incredibly important that we fire the spark at exactly the right time every single time, potentially hundreds of times every single second. So we've got distributor systems and we have distributor-less systems. So ignition systems with a distributor and ignition systems without a distributor. And we've got pretty much one of each of these types here in the shop. So we're going to start out by taking a look at this Civic with a distributor. Taking a closer look, we can see our distributor is here on the left side of the motor. Inside of this, we actually have our ignition coil built in. So it's all inside this one unit, which in the case of Honda, if you're buying it from the dealership, makes it pretty expensive. We're going to see on the Jeep here in a second that the ignition coil is actually separate. And remember, the ignition coil is the thing that actually makes the spark, and then the distributor is going to distribute that spark and send it to the cylinder that it needs to spark in at exactly the right moment every single time. So we drive the distributor by the camshaft. So if we look, it's kind of right here on this axis, right on our intake cam. So that way we know it's always spinning and it's always going to be right. If we look at the end of our distributor, we have this plastic cap. And this plastic cap is where our plug wires go into. I'll pull this thing apart in here in a second and show you the actual guts of it, but let's just follow what we can see. The cylinders themselves on a Honda motor, Honda actually numbers them from right to left. So this is cylinder 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can look on our firing order, or if we remember from looking at the positions of these different pistons, that cylinders 1 and 4 are timed together, and cylinders 2 and 3 are timed together. And they're on opposite strokes of each other. So the firing order on this motor is going to be 1, 3, 4, 2. And if we look at our distributor cap, we can see that cylinder 1, all the way on the far right there, we follow this wire down, goes right here. So the rotor inside of this is going to spin and bring the spark from our ignition coil to the rotor, out to the cap. The spark actually goes from the, in this car, it goes from the coil to the cap, to the rotor, then back to a different part of the cap, and then shoots out to our cylinder number 1. And then going around this way, it spins in this direction, cylinder 1, cylinder 3, cylinder 4, cylinder 2. So if we were to follow these wires down, and then it goes right back to cylinder 1 again. 1, 3, 4, 2. 1, 3, 4, 2. On some distributors, there's going to be a little mark that lets you know where cylinder number 1 is, but for this distributor cap, for whatever reason, this is a cheapo one bought off of Amazon that I needed to buy in a pinch, it's not marked, so you'd have to jump on Identifix to try and find out what your firing order is to kind of find the road map for where these wires go. You know, it's not super bad on a 4-cylinder, but if you're working with like a V8 or a V6 where you've got 3 feet of wires going in all directions, it might get a little hairy. Let's pull this distributor apart and see what we've got going on inside of here. There are 3 kind of bolts, or there's actually Phillips head screw things on here, but if you can use a socket, use a socket. There's 3 on here, 1 here, 1 here, and there's 1 down here on the bottom, which means you're probably going to drop it, which is always fantastic. The other thing to be careful too when you're putting these back together is that you do not over-tighten these, because this cap is made of plastic, and you can just snap it clean off. You can kind of snap one of those ears off. Are these capacitive? Oh yeah, they are. Awesome. All right, so these screws actually kind of hold themselves in place so that you don't drop them. Thank you, super cheap Amazon distributor. See this thing starting to work itself off? So now we got this thing apart. So now that we got this apart, let's follow the path of our spark. So the ignition coil is right up here in the top. It's under this plastic cover that I have to remove the rotor in order to get to it. So the ignition coil is up inside of here, and that's what creates our spark. So the spark fires, and it's going to travel down this bit here and this spring, which then sends the spark into this part of our cap. So if we look over the top of it, it's this bit right here. So the spark goes into the cap here and then travels down a piece of wire that's inside the plastic and then goes to this little spring-loaded piece, at which point the spark then jumps here to the middle of our rotor. And you can see where there's kind of a contact wear mark from this little spring part touching the center of my rotor. So then the spark then travels down the rotor to this outside edge of our rotor. And you can see there's some metal sandwich there in between what looks like some fiberglass. From there, the spark then jumps back to the cap to one of these posts that go around. Remember, cylinder 1, 3, 4, 2, 1, 3, 4, 2, 1, 3, 4, 2, 1, 3, around and around and around we go. So then it jumps from the rotor back to our cap onto one of these posts, down to our wire, then down to our cylinder. So that's a distributor system. Incredibly complicated, way more complex than it needs to be, but there are several different other options that we can use when we're trying to send spark to our motor. So here's our Wrangler, and we can still see our distributor right here. It's got that same kind of black plastic cap. It's another 4-cylinder, but we can see there's 5 wires coming off of here. That's because the ignition coil, the thing that actually makes the spark, is not built in. It's not part of the distributor. So if we follow this middle wire here and follow it all the way back, we get, if I can get an angle on it, this bit right here. So this black plastic cylinder here, I'll throw a better picture of this up in the corner, but this is the thing that actually creates our spark. It gets a signal to tell it when to fire the spark from our crank position sensor on this car, I would guess. And then the spark is going to come down out the end, travel down this wire, and come into the middle of my cap. And then from there, this one actually has number 1 marked. So we can follow this wire right here out to cylinder 1, and then we're going to go to cylinder 3, comes out here, goes to cylinder number 3, so 1, 2, 3, 4 back there, 1, 3, this one's going to go over here to cylinder number 4, which it does, and then this one does a short run here up to cylinder number 2. So again, we're in that same 1, 3, 4, 2 firing order for this car as well. But this is not the only way to do it. You know, this looks really, really complicated. And that's a lot of distance for our spark to run, right? It has to go from our ignition coil, down a wire, into the cap. From the cap, it goes to the rotor. From the rotor, it goes back to the cap. Then it goes down a wire, and then it goes to the spark plug. That's a lot of work. And every single inch of wire or travel that spark has to make, it's going to get weaker. So it would make more sense to have an ignition coil, to be a smaller one, for each individual cylinder. So let's take a look at that system. So here on our Accord, we've got a distributor-less system. We notice there is no distributor. There are no spark plug wires. And this is going to be the most common thing that you're going to see on modern vehicles. You know, this is way more efficient. We have way better control over when we fire the spark, and the spark doesn't have to travel as far, so the sparks are actually going to be stronger. So this is a V6, and I've removed our little black plastic cover off of this thing. So it's a 3-liter V6. My money's on single overhead cam looking at this, because cam's going to run down this side, and our spark plugs are over here on the side. So we can unplug our ignition coil. There's just 3 wires on this one, so we can pop this connector off, and then there's these Allen keys that hold it in place. Now I've already cracked this free. We can back this bolt out, and then the ignition coil is just going to slide out. So this is the whole deal. Instead of having one giant ignition coil to create the spark, we've got 6 smaller ones on this one because it's a V6. An individual ignition coil that's sitting on top of the plug. And if we look down the hole that came out of, again, we can see the top of our plug sitting right down in there. We'll talk about how to get that out in our next video when we look at the actual plugs themselves, talk about gap, and also look at the different kind of metals that they're made out of and the different designs of the grounds. And finally, let's take a look at Mr. Dietrich's Fiesta. It's in all sorts of disrepair right now because it's getting a roll cage put in it. This is going to be a future staged rally car. But the ignition system on here, we notice it does have plug wires. So it's kind of like what we would see on a distributor system. But let's follow these wires down and see where they go. It goes onto a rectangle. And there's two rectangles down in here. So there's actually two ignition coils here. There's one on this side, one on this side. But there is no distributor. There's no cap. There's no rotor. There's nothing that's going to spin in here. So what this system does is it wastes a spark. This is called a waste spark ignition system. And if you'll notice, these two go into a single ignition coil, and this one goes here to cylinder, what does Ford number these things? Any numbers on here? No? Oh, yeah, 2. All right, so that one's 2. So here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So cylinders 1 over here and cylinder 4 are together. Cylinders 2 and 3 come back here and are together on this ignition coil. So remember, the outside ones go together on opposite strokes, and the inside two go together on opposite strokes. Sorry if I just gave you the finger there for a second. They go on opposite strokes of each other. So they're moving together, but if cylinder number 1 is on compression, cylinder 2 is going to be on exhaust. Well, this spark is going to fire at both of these at the exact same time. So we're going to have a spark going on our upstroke for compression, but we're also going to have another spark coming up here on our exhaust. Now that doesn't matter, because if we fire a spark on exhaust, who cares? It's just a wasted spark. That's where the name comes from. And we're also going to take a look in the next video on different plugs that we need that are specific to a waste spark ignition system. Look like a double platinum plug, because the spark on cylinder number 1 actually jumps from positive to negative. The spark on cylinder 4 is going to go from negative to positive. So electrode to ground on cylinder number 1, and then ground to electrode on cylinder number 4. We'll talk about that in the next video. We'll talk about that in class, but just be aware that if you have this type of ignition system, you're going to need to buy some sort of special plug. So there's lots of different ways that we can get spark to our motor. But really there's two main types. We've got distributor systems, which is an older technology that's not quite as advanced, it's not quite as precise. And then we have distributor-less systems, both Coil-On-Plug as well as our waste spark systems with one ignition coil firing for 2 cylinders. One in positive fire, one in negative. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, be good, and I will see you next time.